Wives. Mrs. Margaret Anderson, active in the temperance movement, experienced the misery of dealing with an alcoholic husband in her own home, with all the troubles and misery caused by that curse. She has found the solution to the problem, the cure that will work for your husband or any loved one. She has nothing to sell. She merely asks you to send a letter to her requesting your own copy of her explanation of the cure. Send your letter to Mrs. Margaret Anderson, 820 Maple Avenue, Hillborn, New York. Write to her today.
The date is Monday, March 31st, 1929. The location is New York City. The occasion is the annual Easter Parade down Fifth Avenue. If you never lived in New York or visited there at Easter time, you may not realize what the Easter Parade was like then and for many decades. For a parade, you usually expect decorated floats, marching bands, and maybe even huge airborne cartoon balloons like you might see in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Macy's department store in New York sponsored and organized its first Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1934, 5 years after this event we are considering. Macy's parade featured among the bands and floats and other balloons a gigantic balloon of Mickey Mouse as he looked in the 1930s in Disney's animated films. Most of the nation is familiar with the Macy's parade because it has been televised on national television every year since the 1950s. And it's still going strong. Here's one of the many balloons in the parade this year of Grogu, the little child from the Mandalorian show who looks like a baby Yoda. But the Easter parade was something entirely different than the Thanksgiving parade, and it had been going on a lot longer than the Macy's parade. And it never was televised in the same way, so only New Yorkers and visitors would have had a feel for what it entailed. No bands, no balloons, no floats, just regular people parading down the avenue 2 by 2 or in small groups on the sidewalk or in the middle of the street. Women dressed in their finest new spring outfits and elaborate hats, men dressed in their fanciest dress suits, and often top hats, even long after top hats were popular no more for streetwear. It is now a shadow of its former self in the 21st century. Just a few thousand people participate or watch the walkers. But there was a time when there were hundreds of thousands participating. Wikipedia provides a brief overview of the parade throughout its heyday. From the 1880s through the 1950s, New York's Easter Parade was one of the main cultural expressions of Easter in the United States. It was one of the fundamental ways that Easter was identified and celebrated. The seeds of the parade were sown in New York's highly ornamented downtown churches, Gothic buildings such as Trinity Episcopal Church, St. Patrick's Cathedral, and St. Thomas Episcopal Church. In the mid-19th century, these and other churches began decorating their sanctuaries with Easter flowers. The new practice was resisted by traditionalists but was generally well received. As the practice expanded, the floral displays grew ever more elaborate and soon became defining examples of style, taste, abundance, and novelty. Those who attended the churches incorporated these values into their dress. In 1873, a newspaper report about Easter at Christ Church said, "More than half the congregation were ladies who displayed all the gorgeous and marvelous articles of dress. And the appearance of the body of the church thus vied in effect and magnificence with the pleasant and tasteful array of flowers which decorated the chancel. By the 1880s, the Easter parade had become a vast spectacle of fashion and religious observance, famous in New York and around the country. It was an after-church cultural event for the well-to-do. Decked out in new and fashionable clothing, they would stroll from their own church to others to see the impressive flowers and to be seen by their fellow strollers. People from the poorer and middle classes would observe the parade to learn the latest trends in fashion, such as the exotic outfit on this young lady, evidently inspired by Eastern Asian clothing styles popular in the U.S. at the time. By 1890, the annual procession held an important place on New York's calendar of festivities and had taken on its enduring designation as the Easter Parade. As the parade and the holiday together became more important, dry goods merchants and milliners publicized them in the promotion of their wares. Advertisements of the day linked an endless array of merchandise to Easter and the Easter parade. In 1875, Easter had been invisible on the commercial scene. By 1900, it was as important in retailing as the Christmas season is today. It was estimated in 1947 that over 1 million people gathered to gawk at the finery of those in the parade. And crowds had been almost that big for a long time, as you can see from this photo from about 1910. If you are not from New York and never visited at Easter time, you may still have experienced a tiny bit of the Easter parade by watching the classic movie Easter Parade, starring Fred Astaire and Judy Garland, based around the Easter parade of 1912. The movie includes a song by the same name, which includes the words, "In your Easter bonnet with all the frills upon it, you'll be the grandest lady in the Easter parade. I'll be all in clover, and when they look you over, I'll be the proudest feller in the Easter parade. On the avenue, Fifth Avenue, the photographers will snap us, and you'll find that you're in the rotogravure." Throughout my life, I'd heard the song, but only recently did I find out the meaning of rotogravure and what it had to do with photographers. The term rotogravure refers to a certain type of printing process that uses a rotary printing press. Once a staple of newspaper photo features, the rotogravure process is still used for commercial printing of magazines, postcards, and corrugated cardboard product packaging. In the 1930s through 60s, newspapers published relatively few photographs, and instead many newspapers published separate rotogravure sections in their Sunday editions. These sections were devoted to photographs and identifying captions, not news stories. Here's a sample page of a rotogravure section from a Syracuse, New York paper in 1930. That's New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt, a paraplegic polio victim himself, visiting young polio victims. In Irving Berlin's song Easter Parade, the photographers will snap us and you'll find that you're in the rotogravure, is saying that the lady in the song will be so glamorous that newspaper photographers will take her picture, and it will be printed in the Sunday paper's rotogravure section. In 1932, a George Gallup survey of reader interest in various sections of Sunday newspapers to determine the relative value of rotogravure as an advertising medium found that these special rotogravures were the most widely read sections of the paper, and that advertisements there were 3 times more likely to be seen by readers than in any other section. So now we go back to where we began, the Easter Parade of 1929. It contains a mystery case we need to solve. The rotogravure Photographers were working the parade all day, trying to find interesting people to snap to use in their upcoming Sunday edition. And suddenly, there they were. Out in the middle of the crowd, there were several attractive young women in fashionable clothing, marching down the street side by side, all of them blatantly smoking cigarettes. Looking around, the photographers spotted other young women doing the same, such as this one with her dog. And as the photographers kept looking, they also spotted some young women arm in arm with their husbands, both of them smoking, such as this couple. The reason the photographers were excited by this amazing find was that it was absolutely a cultural rule at the time that respectable women of any age must not smoke cigarettes out in public places. They could smoke in their own home, or in the lobby of a theater during an intermission, or at a private party. But walking down the middle of Fifth Avenue on Easter morning, just coming from church, was definitely a huge flouting of custom. So the photographers indeed snapped them, and they found that they were in the rotogravures and the regular newspaper sections the following Sunday. Not just in New York City papers, like this article in the Brooklyn paper. Papers all across the land picked up the story from the Associated Press and included snippets in their own papers, including these from Colorado and Oklahoma. And the photos had induced a cacophony of gossip and grumbling among the masses about the issue of females having the liberty to smoke in public. Our question for this NHSI case is, just who were these young women? Why had they decided to all pick the same day to smoke in public for the first time? And why on earth would they pick Easter Sunday to do it? The answers to those questions are going to tell us a lot more about the social psychology of America of the past and present than you might think possible. But to get to that understanding, we have to take another trip in the time machine, this one forward to the mid-1960s.
Ladies, a new marriage can be very stressful. Perhaps you are newly married and fighting the same health challenges as this lovely young bride, especially constipation. How hard it must be to settle into a routine as a housewife and homemaker and companion to a new husband if you have intestinal sluggishness that makes you miserable. Even single young women and older married women can experience that same kind of miserable sluggishness, along with perhaps colds, biliousness, nervousness, and headaches. Just one simple pill can serve to release you from all those maladies. NR from the Nature's Remedy Company is the solution you have been looking for. Just 25 cents a package at your nearest druggist. As the NR slogan says, NR tonight, tomorrow all right.
So here we are in 1967. That's me as a college student at Michigan State University in my senior year. My major was education, and I was always particularly fascinated by my courses in psychology and social psychology. I was very impressed with the popular writings of journalist, social commentator, and social critic Vance Packard. I hung around at bookstores a lot and was always excited to see a new offering by him on one of my shopping trips. I had several of his books, including The Waste Makers, The People Shapers, and Nation of Strangers. But like most people, his first biting commentary that I read in about 1965 was his first bestseller, The Hidden Persuaders. It was published in 1957. His introduction to the book explained what he meant by the title. This book is an attempt to explore a strange and rather exotic new area of American life. It is about the large-scale efforts being made, often with impressive success, to channel our unthinking habits, our purchasing decisions, and our thought processes by the use of insights gleaned from psychiatry and the social sciences. Typically, these efforts take place beneath our level of awareness, so that the appeals which move us are often, in a sense, hidden. The result is that many of us are being influenced and manipulated far more than we realize in the patterns of our everyday lives. Some of the manipulating being attempted is simply amusing. Some of it is disquieting, particularly when viewed as a portent of what may be ahead on a more intensive and effective scale for us all. Cooperative scientists have come along providentially to furnish some awesome tools. The use of mass psychoanalysis to guide campaigns of persuasion has become the basis of a multi-million-dollar industry. Professional persuaders have seized upon it in their groping for more effective ways to sell us their wares, whether products, ideas, attitudes, candidates, goals, or states of mind.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry. Let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep. Get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
The rest of the book explained how central understanding the subconscious was to the methods used by these hidden persuaders. As Packard put it, the findings of the depth probers provide startling explanations for many of our daily habits and perversities. It seems that our subconscious can be pretty wild and unruly. What the probers are looking for, of course, are the whys of our behavior so that they can more effectively manipulate our habits and choices in their favor. This has led them to probe why we are afraid of blanks, why we love those big fat cars, why we really buy homes, why men smoke cigars, why the kind of car we drive reveals the brand of gasoline we will buy, why housewives typically fall into a hypnoidal trance when they get into a supermarket, why men are drawn into auto showrooms by convertibles but end up buying sedans, and why Junior loves cereal that pops, snaps, and crackles. And it gave numerous explanations of specific tricks of the trade contemporary advertising experts of the mid-50s were using to affect the buying habits of the American public. For instance, they had noticed that impulse buying of groceries had grown by leaps and bounds for nearly 2 decades. Housewives and husbands and kids seldom went to the store with a complete list of groceries they needed, and they seldom came home without a significant collection of items they had not intended to buy. Packard explained a theory of a motivational analyst named James Vickery, who wondered why so much impulse buying was going on compared to decades past. Vickery suspected that some special psychology must be going on inside the women as they shopped in supermarkets. His suspicion was that perhaps they underwent such an increase in tension when confronted with so many possibilities, they were forced into making quick purchases. He set out to find out if this was true. The best way to detect what was going on inside the shopper was a galvanometer or lie detector. That was obviously impractical. The next best thing was to use a hidden motion picture camera and record the eye blink rate of the women as they shopped. Blinking eyes? What on earth does that have to do with buying groceries? How fast a person blinks his eyes is a pretty good index of his state of inner tension. The average person, according to Mr. Vickery, normally blinks his eyes about 32 times a minute. If he is tense, he blinks them more frequently. Under extreme tension, up to 50 or 60 times a minute. If he is notably relaxed, on the other hand, his eye blink rate may drop to a subnormal 20 or less. Mr. Vickery set up his cameras and started following the ladies as they entered the store. The results were startling even to him. Their eye blink rate, instead of going up to indicate mounting tension, went down and down to a very subnormal 14 blinks a minute. The ladies fell into what Mr. Vickery calls a hypnoidal trance. A light kind of trance, he explains, is the first stage of hypnosis. Interestingly, many of these women were in such a trance that they passed by neighbors and old friends without noticing or greeting them. Some had a sort of glassy stare. They were so entranced as they wandered about the store, plucking things off shelves at random, that they would bump into boxes without seeing them and do not even notice the camera, although in some cases their face would pass within a foot and a half of the spot where the hidden camera was clicking away. So what happened at the end of this sleepwalking shopping excursion? When the wives had filled their carts or satisfied themselves and started towards the checkout counter, their eye blink rate would start rising up to a slightly subnormal 25 blinks per minute. Then, at the sound of the cash register bell and the voice of the clerk asking for money, the eye blink rate would race up past normal to a high abnormal of 45 blinks per minute. In many cases, it turned out that the women did not have enough money to pay for all the nice things they'd put in the cart. In his Hidden Persuaders book, Packard explained that in this beckoning field of impulse buying, psychologists had teamed up with merchandising experts to persuade the wife to buy products she might not particularly need or even want until she happens to see them invitingly presented. The 60 million American women who were going into supermarkets every week in the mid-1950s were getting help in their purchases and splurchases from psychologists and psychiatrists hired by the food merchandisers. On May 18, 1956, the New York Times printed a remarkable interview with a young man named Gerald Stahl, Executive Vice President of the Package Designers Council. He stated, quote, "Psychiatrists say that people have so much to choose from that they want help. They will like the package that hypnotizes them into picking it." He urged food packers to put more hypnosis into their package designing so that the housewife will stick out her hand for it rather than one of its many rivals. Packard went on to describe numerous methods the advertisers used to put more hypnosis in their package designs, and the rest of the book added many more insights into other methods used by the hidden persuaders. I was surprised and amazed by the information at the time in 1967. Fast forward 57 years. I'm now in my 70s. I long ago forgot almost everything I read in Packard's books, including The Hidden Persuaders. Maybe I internalized a tiny bit of it and it fortified my resistance to the persuasive methods. For many years, I really have had a complete shopping list almost every time I go to the grocery store and almost never buy anything on impulse. But in general, I went on to having interests in a wide variety of other topics over the years and didn't spend much time ever thinking about those hidden persuaders lurking out there. I do, however, remember assuming at the time back in the 60s that this was a thoroughly modern phenomenon. Probably developed, I figured, by men on Madison Avenue, starting sometime in the late 1940s or early 50s, as portrayed in the recent Mad Men TV series. Packard implied as much in his book, even starting his introduction with the term exotic new when speaking of tactics aimed at our subconscious. So imagine my surprise a while ago when I discovered that this was a misperception on Packard's part. Either he just hadn't done much historical study on advertising, or there were limited resources available for such study in the mid-1950s. This is certainly understandable. In the past 2 decades, the internet has created an explosion of easily accessible information in vast quantities, just about any historical subject imaginable. Information that might have taken years, even decades, to ferret out from the book stacks and periodical collections in musty libraries 50 years ago is just a Google search away now. Oh, there may be a few tricks of the trade that are fairly new in recent times, but there was an astonishing amount of hidden persuasion going on in America a century and more ago, much of it perpetuated by the advertising industry and used to get people to spend money they couldn't really afford on things they didn't need, and to hypnotize people into choosing one brand over another for totally subconscious, even completely irrational reasons. And people back then were little the wiser about how they were being manipulated by the hidden persuaders than most people are now. Let me take you behind that long ago curtain and meet the wizard. Oh, not the Wizard of Oz. We will meet the Wizard of Adz. In the 1939 Wizard of Oz movie, Oz the Great and Powerful was just an illusion made with the proverbial smoke and mirrors. The wizard had no powers to do anything other than scare people with his smoke and mirrors. When he was separated from all his methods of illusion, the character, played by Frank Morgan, wasn't imposing and fearful at all. In the same way, Edward L. Bernays didn't look powerful. He was short, plain. In fact, some might say he appeared rather wimpy and ineffectual in person. Don't let appearances fool you. Eddie Bernays, as he was sometimes called by friend and foe alike, manipulated masses of people more powerfully than most men before or since. Unlike the Wizard of Oz, Eddie did have almost magical powers of persuasion and the skills to use them wondrously successfully. Obviously, we know that looks can be deceiving. Don't be deceived by Eddie's mild-mannered looks. After studying his life and accomplishments, I've come to realize that Eddie Bernays is one of those most influential people you've never heard of. I don't remember ever hearing or reading his name before about a decade ago, but since the first time I noticed it, I seem to see it everywhere in my reading now because he had so much influence in so many areas of American life and even politics. He's a little like the fictional Forrest Gump character, showing up unexpectedly in all sorts of settings. Back in his heyday, Bernays was somewhere around the fringes when all sorts of big things were happening, pulling strings, but choosing to stay out of the public eye personally. You can see him in a picture at age 26 in France at the end of a line of people at the Paris Peace Conference that ended World War I. Or here he is on the right at age 50 at an event with Eleanor Roosevelt. And it was indeed a long heyday. Born in 1891, he died in 1995 at 103. Here he is in 1991 at about 99. Even then, he was still giving interviews and talking about his career. So, what did Eddie do? He was, as one of his biographers called him, the father of spin. The term spin in this context means a particular bias, interpretation, or point of view intended to create a favorable, or sometimes unfavorable, impression when presented to the public. Eddie did a lot of spinning in his life. He's considered by many to have had the most historical influence of any one person in the creation of the modern role of the public relations man. In other words, Eddie did PR. Some claim he personally even coined the popular use of the term public relations. Not just advertising, he would be quick to point out, if you called him an ad man. The typical ad man, from Eddie's point of view, was a fellow who badgered people into buying a product, usually with methods that emphasized, either truthfully or deceptively, the details of the alleged fine qualities of the product that made it superior to similar products and what a great value it was for the price. This is what advertising typically meant at the turn of the last century, like this information from a Sears Roebuck catalog of 1908 on rocking chairs. This kind of ad was purely informational. Catalogs at the time were typically full of this type of advertising. It emphasized paragraph after mind-numbing paragraph of teeny print describing every excruciating detail of the bargain you were being offered, along with close-up photos or artist renderings of the item showing its every feature. Why? Because the typical advertising man of the time was convinced that what people really wanted in order to make buying decisions was practical information they could use to make rational purchasing choices. But you see, Eddie Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He had studied his uncle's writings and even arranged to have Freud's introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, notes from 1915 to 17, translated into English and published in a book in America. The first popular exposure American readers had to Freud's theories. Yes, Eddie knew all about the unconscious. He knew better than to think that the mass of humankind are coolly rational beings. In addition to the theories of his Austrian Uncle Siggy, Eddie was strongly influenced by the writings of the French author Gustave Le Bon, who popularized the theory of crowd psychology with his 1895 book, The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind. And Eddie was also strongly influenced by the writings of the British pioneering neurosurgeon Wilfred Trotter, who wrote a famous book, now a classic in the field, in 1916 titled Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War. As a result of these influences, Eddie had been one of the first of his generation to realize and act upon the understanding that persuading people to buy a product, to support a cause, to vote for a candidate, was much more effectively done by applying principles from psychology and psychiatry than by trying to sell it to them with a frontal assault on their rational mind. Bernays had been acting on this understanding in his business career for barely a decade by 1923 when he wrote the very first book on the topic of public relations, Crystallizing Public Opinion. Listen to his opinion from that book about the ability for rational thinking of the common man. Quote, "The average citizen is the world's most efficient censor. His own mind is the greatest barrier between him and the facts. His own logic proof compartments, his own absolutism, are the obstacles which prevent him from seeing in terms of experience and thought rather than in terms of group reaction." 5 years later, in 1928, he wrote another book on the topic titled Propaganda. Listen to the underpinnings of his PR efforts on behalf of American businesses, as well as his role in selling more than one president to the public, the selling of more than one war to the public, the selling of much more. He wrote in the Propaganda book, "If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing about it? The recent practice of propaganda has proved that it is possible, at least up to a certain point, and within certain limits." He went on in the book to pontificate. "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized." And continuing on, "Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind." Eddie Bernays meant this to be encouraging. Otherwise, he insisted, there would be chaos and anarchy. Does all of this sound a bit creepily familiar? Perhaps because it was a well-known fact that Hitler's Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, was an admirer of Eddie's writings. Goebbels was one of the first chief architects of the Holocaust. Yes, crystallizing public opinion and propaganda were in Goebbels' personal library. Goebbels was an ardent student of Eddie, despite the fact that Eddie was Jewish. Goebbels desperately wanted to meet Eddie and was said to have sent numerous books to him to be autographed. Eddie regretted this unwelcome connection when its significance became clear in later years, but didn't take it as criticism of his theories, just an example of how they could be used by unscrupulous people. In the right hands, they were the tools of democracy. In Eddie's own hands, they were tools over the years to promote a wide variety of products, ideas, people, causes, and even wars. His corporate clients had included, among many others, Procter & Gamble, American Tobacco Company, United Fruit Company, remember Chiquita Banana? General Electric, Dodge Motors, and Knox Gelatin. Causes he'd helped promote included the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. He was the one who encouraged them in about 1949 to shorten the name of the disease in their promotional materials to simply MS. The NAACP, and the fluoridation of water. He helped with the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and Calvin Coolidge in 1924. He helped promote U.S. entry into World War I, the overthrow of the democratically elected president of Guatemala in 1954, and the interests of South Vietnam in the early 1960s. And he was the publicity director for the whole gigantic 1939 New York World's Fair. Understanding about Eddie allows us to go back to where we started and get some answers, at the Easter Parade of 1929 and the mystery of the smoking debutantes. Early in 1929, George Washington Hill, head of the American Tobacco Company, maker of Lucky Strike cigarettes, summoned his advertising man at the time, Eddie Bernays, and demanded, "How can we get women to smoke on the street? They're smoking indoors, but damn it, if they spend half of the time outdoors and we can get them to smoke outdoors, we'll damn near double our female market. Do something. Act." In the Father of Spin book, author Ty explains what happened next. Bernays understood they were up against a social taboo that cast doubt on the character of women who smoked, but he wasn't sure of the basis of the inhibition or how it could be overcome. So he got Hill to agree to pay for a consultation with A.A. Brill, the psychoanalyst and disciple of Bernays' uncle, Dr. Sigmund Freud. "It is perfectly normal for women to want to smoke cigarettes," Brill advised. "The emancipation of women has suppressed many of their feminine desires. More women now do the same work as men do. Many women bear no children. Those who do bear have fewer children. Feminine traits are masked. Cigarettes, which are equated with men, become torches of freedom." It had taken women almost 150 years from the time of the Declaration of Independence to even get the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, less than a decade before this current story about Eddie begins. Women's rights and equality of opportunity with men were still very hot topics in the U.S. society, and Eddie was always ready to use the latest trends and hot topics to bolster sales for his clients. He was also always ready to use the insights of his Uncle Siggy's psychoanalytic theories, and thus Eddie began his scheming.
Ladies, in the middle of your busy days full of activity, of overwork, of overplay, and overthinking, you deserve to take a break to be refreshed with delicious, thirst-quenching Coca-Cola. Sold everywhere, just 5 cents a glass.
Eddie particularly favored choreographing public spectacles as part of his methods, and he came up with a splendiferous one for this project. He would insert his own sideshow into the wildly popular New York Easter Parade. Eddie Bernays was a resident of New York City and intimately familiar with the popularity of the parade. He was also intimately familiar with the popularity and power of the newspaper rotogravure sections. If Bernays wanted to spread his message widely, the New York Easter Parade was the place to stage a scene to attract reporters and photographers, and the rotogravures, the American press, would provide the avenue to spread those photos from coast to coast almost immediately. almost 100 years before social media on the internet. As usual, Eddie hid in the shadows while pulling the strings, providing himself plausible deniability. These staged events were always supposed to appear to be grassroots, virtually spontaneous activities springing from the intentions of just common folks, like these young women just happening to all start smoking publicly for the first time. In this case, Eddie contacted a friend who worked at Vogue magazine and got addresses for 30 debutantes. He then sent a telegram to each, signed by his secretary, Bertha Hunt. The telegram read, quote, "In the interests of equality of the sexes and to fight another sex taboo, I and other young women will light another torch of freedom by smoking cigarettes while strolling on Fifth Avenue Easter Sunday. We are doing this to combat the silly prejudice that the cigarette is suitable for the home, the restaurant, the taxicab, the theater lobby, but never, no, never for the sidewalk. Women smokers and their escorts will stroll from 48th Street to 54th Street on Fifth Avenue between 11:30 and 1 o'clock. Eddie also placed an ad with similar wording in New York newspapers signed by Ruth Hale, a leading feminist and wife of New York World columnist Haywood Brown, announcing what sounded like just the jolly plan of some free-spirited young women. But of course it was anything but a casual whim. The script for the parade was outlined in revealing detail in a memo from Bernays' office. The object of the event, it explained, would be to generate, quote, "stories that for the first time women have smoked openly in the street. These will take care of themselves as legitimate news if the staging is rightly done." Undoubtedly, after the stories and pictures have appeared, there will be protests from non-smokers and believers in heaven, home, and mother. These should be watched for and answered in the same papers. The memo also discussed prominent churches the parade would pass and from which it would like marchers to join up, including St. Thomas's, St. Patrick's, and, quote, "the Baptist church where John D. Rockefeller attends." Rockefeller was one of the wealthiest men in America at the time. What kind of marchers would be best? Quote, "because it would appear as news with no division of the publicity, actresses should be definitely out. On the other hand, if young women who stand for feminism, someone from the Women's Party, say, could be secured, the fact that the movement would be advertised too would not be bad. While they should be good-looking, they should not look too model-y. 3 for each church covered should be sufficient. Of course, they are not to smoke simply as they come down the church steps. They are to join in the Easter parade, puffing away." As usual, Eddie managed all this behind the scenes as if it was a military campaign. The memo made it clear that not much would be left to chance. Quote, "on Monday of Holy Week, the women should be definitely decided upon. On the afternoon of Good Friday, they should be in this office by appointment and given their final instructions. They should be told where and when they are to be on duty Easter morning and furnished with lucky strikes. As the fashionable churches are crowded on Easter, they must be impressed with the necessity of going early. Business must be worked out as if by a theatrical director, as for example, one woman seeking another smoke opens her purse, finds cigs but no matches, asks the other for a light. At least some of the women should have men with them. Finally, there was the matter of ensuring that the march would be preserved for posterity. Quote, "we should have a photographer to take pictures for later use in the roto sections to guard against the possibility that the news photographers do not get good pictures for this purpose." And all of the meticulous planning paid off. The actual march went off much more smoothly than even its scriptwriters imagined. 10 young women turned out, marching down Fifth Avenue with their lighted torches of freedom, and the newspapers loved it. 2-column pictures showed elegant ladies with floppy hats and fur-trimmed coats, cigarettes held self-consciously by their sides as they paraded down the wide boulevard. Oh, and that smoking couple on the left? That is columnist Haywood Brown and his wife, Ruth Hale. And indeed, the press all across the country took gleeful interest in the spectacle. Dispatches ran the next day, generally on page 1, in papers from Fremont, Nebraska, to Portland, Oregon, to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Typical was this one from the United Press. Just as Miss Frederica Frelinghausen, conspicuous in a tailored outfit of dark gray, pushed her way through the jam in front of St. Mark's, Miss Bertha Hunt and 6 colleagues struck another blow in behalf of the liberty of women. Down Fifth Avenue they strolled, puffing at cigarettes. Miss Hunt issued the following communique from the smoke-clouded battlefield. I hope that we have started something and that these torches of freedom, with no particular brand favored, will smash the discriminatory taboo on cigarettes for women, and that our sex will go on breaking down all discriminations. But was it just a gimmick for people to gawk at? Did it actually affect the actions of others? Indeed it did. During the following days, women were reported to be taking to the streets, lighted cigarettes in hand in Boston and Detroit, Wheeling, West Virginia, and San Francisco. Women's clubs, meanwhile, were enraged by the spectacle, and for weeks afterward, editorial writers churned out withering prose, pro and con. Thumbs down, said the News in Everett, Massachusetts, while John A. Schaefer, editor and publisher of the Chicago Evening Post, the Indianapolis Star, the Terre Haute Star, and the Muncie Star agreed that it is always a regret to me to see women adopt the coarser attitudes and habits of men. But the headline in the Ventura, California Star, quote, swats another taboo, unquote, suggested the march may have achieved its aim, and a few weeks later, Broadway theaters created a stir by admitting women to what had been men-only smoking rooms. Eddie's ego was big enough that he no doubt expected to get good results from his efforts, but perhaps even he was surprised at just how easily it could be pulled off and how widely and quickly it could spread. The uproar he touched off proved enlightening to Bernays. Age-old customs, I learned, could be broken down by a dramatic appeal, disseminated by the network of media, he wrote in his memoirs. Of course, the taboo was not destroyed completely, but a beginning had been made. Never underestimate the powers of the hidden persuaders, nor how long ago they were already busily at work playing with people's emotions. I remind you, this was not done in 2024 with the aid of the millions of ever-vigilant cell phone camera-equipped man-on-the-street eye-reporters of the nation, and with computers and the internet superhighway as the avenue through which to spread a story instantaneously throughout the land. It was done old school with telegrams, hard copy paper pages, and reporters using rotary dial phones to call in their stories, which a secretary would then peck out on a clunky old typewriter like this 1929 Underwood. And yet the strange little project, masterminded by one timid-looking little fellow behind a curtain, literally did catch the imagination of the nation overnight. People worry these days that the era of Big Brother and his persuasive methods are upon us. Nah, they've been around for over a century. The Torches of Freedom campaign remains a classic in the world of public relations, one still cited in classrooms and boardrooms as an example of ballyhoo at its most brilliant, and more important, of creative analysis of social symbols and how they can be manipulated.